Thank you everyone for joining our presentation. My name is Rachel and I'm on the marketing team here, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. During today's presentation, we will be giving you a brief overview of Ionic 5, which will include a short demo, and then it'll be followed by a Q&A portion. So before getting started, I'd want to go over some of the housekeeping notes. The presentation will be about 30 minutes long. It is being recorded, so after the event, we will share a link to the presentation for you to watch on demand, and we'll also provide a link to the slides, so you'll have access to all of this content after the event. The presentation will be about 30 minutes, and we'll use the remaining time to answer your questions. So if any questions come up during the presentation, please submit them so that we can answer them after the event. Just use the chat box on your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So if you have any technical issues or concerns, you can also send me a message in your Q&A panel and I'll try and help you. So giving today's presentation, I've got Mike Hardington here with us. He's Ionic's developer advocate. And for the Q&A portion, I've actually got Brandy Carney, who is our lead framework engineer, and she'll be joining us later on in the event. So Mike, I'll pass it over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Welcome everyone to the webinar. We're going to be going over what's new with Ionic 5. As Rachel said, my name's Mike Hardington. If you want to reach out, you can reach out on Twitter, mhardington, or you can shoot me an email. I'll try to respond as quickly as I can. But yeah, reach out if you have any questions or if you have anything specific about your app we want to talk about. So we all know really what Ionic is. It is a collection of components, some gestures, animations to help developers build their mobile apps more effectively. And while we started off with the goal of let's just help developers build hybrid and mobile apps, we now see Ionic being adopted for other platforms as well. So iOS and Android are still around, but we see progressive web apps being a huge target for Ionic. We also see desktop apps with technologies like Electron becoming more and more common in our developer circle. Now, as we've gone through and started building out these components, we've had a lot of change in what Ionic actually is from a technology standpoint. From the very beginnings, we were very tied to Angular, first with AngularJS. Now, as we moved on, we went to Angular 2, 3, but we always wanted to have support for these other frameworks and libraries that exist out there. The big thing that we kind of want to avoid, though, was just rewrite. We didn't want to spend all this time developing for, say, Ionic React or Ionic whatever framework that exists. We didn't want to go through and have to rewrite all of our components over and over and over again. We'd be rewriting the framework multiple times versus just actually maintaining one core. Now, this is where we discovered web components and everything that they could offer to help us develop Ionic and then support the greater ecosystem. So in about 6 months worth of work, we were able to rewrite all of our components as web components and then create these really self-contained chunks of code that could be easily ported to other frameworks. Where there were cases where those frameworks didn't offer any, or where those frameworks required more work, for instance, routing is a big issue here, we would dive down into the framework specifics and then create those packages, but only actually spend about 10% of the code base on that one particular issue. So 90% of our code and 90% of our components are framework agnostic. It's only those small cases like routing where we needed to actually integrate with a framework in a more traditional manner. So we're being able to target React, Angular, in some capacities Vue, and not have to rewrite all those components over and over. Now, this is part of our 4.0 initiative. We dubbed it Ionic for Everyone because we truly wanted to see Ionic grow beyond just Angular and into other ecosystems and other frameworks. Now, with this, we got a lot of feedback from people, and a lot of developers were super excited about this. We thought there was going to be a little bit more churn here and there, but people were very excited to see that, hey, we could use Ionic with React, or we could use Ionic with no framework at all. And while we were able to refocus our energies on supporting the core frameworks, we're actually able to take all that free time now and focus on how do we integrate better with these frameworks. So for example, we now use the Angular CLI, we use Angular schematics for Angular projects. With React projects, we use React scripts for our development environment. So it's better for us in terms of being able to quickly work on these components and have it just update across frameworks, but then also able to integrate better with these frameworks as a whole. So this led to a big question that we had. Well, if we spend all this time working on Ionic 4 and building up all these new components and rewriting the framework, one final time, where do we go from here? What happens next? And when we were thinking about this, we kind of reflected back on how much time we worked on V4 and all the work that was going into that. And what we found is that it ended up being about a year of work solely on V4. So from the day it was released to about a couple weeks ago, there was a full year of development on V4 and getting people updated to the latest version. In that time, we saw platforms move a lot faster. So iOS was on iOS 12, but then we also saw iOS 13 come out. So we've had two major versions of iOS be released. And in those releases, we saw massive redesign and how their components work and how their design system behaves. We've also seen Material Design evolve even more and start to really solidify their design system and kind of be a little bit more similar to how iOS does things in certain use cases. But their design language has evolved and had a lot of updates that weren't reflected in Ionic. And at the same time, we saw PWAs become even more important and even more essential to how developers build apps and ship things. So while we were looking at all this, we had realized that our components needed a design refresh. They needed to be updated and better embrace how the native systems and native platforms, how they look and feel and how they interact, and then also take into consideration all the components and all the improvements to our framework ecosystems and how we can apply those to Ionic itself. So we kind of tied this into three different categories: component refresh, remove any deprecated APIs, and then update to our framework integrations to the latest and greatest versions. So let's kind of dive into those real quick. So the design aspect is something that we spent a lot of time working on. Conversations that we've had in the design, the design docs that we've pulled up, there was a lot of thought going into Ionic 5 on how do these components behave and what is actually going on behind the scenes. Now, I will admit, we did focus a lot on iOS as a major design upgrade. There were a lot of updates as well to Material Design, but they actually came at a much more stable release. We were getting updates and following Material Design throughout the entire course of Ionic 4, but iOS was just a big batch of updates and redesigns, all coming from iOS 13. So with our updated design, we've completely revamped all the components to match what Apple says their components should look like, and have followed those pretty closely. Now, this isn't just about the design and the CSS of these components. We also have dove into our animations and the gesture support to make sure that however these components are being added or used, they follow the animations exactly, and then they follow those gestures to a T. So here's an example of some of these design languages that we're seeing. Now, the big one that is particular for iOS is the large titles inside of the header right above the scrollable content. We see the font and the typography, the font weights have changed a bit, the way everything is structured, how elements are vertically centered within each one of those items. And then also that little border towards the bottom of the item, how does that line up and what's the overall theme of this? So fun story, I had shown this slide to a few people beforehand. They had asked, well, why are you showing me iOS's default mail app? I was like, this isn't. This is Ionic's redesigned component in library, redefined component set updated for iOS 13. So everything that we're seeing here is all just web technology. It's all Ionic, from the little notification button towards the end to the actual font weights and large titles. This is all just built into it. So another area that we focused on was just how the interactions work. So for example, on the left, we have a version of the phone app where we're using the segments to toggle all calls and then calls that we missed. Now, the segment that we have up there is very iOS 12. Uses these kind of bold outlined buttons, and it feels right for iOS 12. But with iOS 13, they introduced a new design for how segments should behave that feels a little bit more like a physical button. So we followed this, we broke down the design and how this should interact, and have updated our components to best match this. Now, this isn't just, oh, we changed a few CSS things here and there. It's a complete refactor on how does this segment work internally without introducing many breaking changes for how developers would consume this. So this is a really, really nice update to segments, and it only touches on the surface of how many components we've updated to adopt this. We've also focused on those animations and gesture supports that we have in here. So for example, here, if we toggle a modal, the animation will go ahead and present the modal, but then also animate out the backdrop inside of our component set. So the presenting element is going to go away into the back, not be part of the main scene, more or less, while the new modal sheet animates above it and presents in a much more native-like experience. Now, this works for both light mode and dark mode. And as we can present the modal, we can also tap a button to close it as we would normally do, or swipe down to dismiss it, so that way we're integrating and feeling a little bit more closer to what native has. So in addition to just focusing on, can we update these components to look better and look closer to their native equivalents, we took a lot of feedback from the community and figure out what can we do to better help developers as they are starting to customize these experiences and customize these components to better fit their needs. Now, a lot of this resulted in exposing more of the internals of our components through CSS variables, but then also doing investigation inside of new CSS standards called shadow parts, or new HTML standards called shadow parts. Now, this allows us to expose internal components of our Ionic components without you having to go through and declare the CSS using important or hack inside of the web component themselves. This is something that we're heavily experimenting with. It is shipping now in Chrome and Safari. And we really are excited to see shadow parts become a standard and be available on all browsers. Now, with this, exposing the CSS variables, exposing things through shadow parts, updating design, the overall goal of this was just to keep Ionic looking up to date and modern with these overall design systems that we have from iOS and from Material Design. So I think we're pretty, we pretty much achieved that. So I'm very excited for this, and it looks really great. The next section that we want to target was our updating of APIs. We had already provided some deprecation warnings for certain features here and there, but now we actually had the chance, being our first major release since before, to go through and remove certain APIs. So a lot of this comes down to CSS attributes and a few options when creating overlays. So if you're coming from React and using Ionic React currently, this actually doesn't affect you. You've been using CSS classes instead of attributes since day one. What we noticed is instead of creating two versions of our CSS, one for attributes and one for classes, it didn't really make sense to do that. We should just solidify on one and go with that. So we ended up removing the attribute support in V5. But before we even did that, we knew that we want to remove them. So we have a bunch of deprecation warnings that were already being printed out in your into your browser console since early releases of 4.6 and 4.7. So these are not anything that came out of nowhere. These are warnings that we had fully intended on doing in super early releases. So we removed those CSS attributes, solidified on CSS classes, and now have a consistent experience across iOS, across Angular, and across React. With overlays, we've had a couple different ways of how to create an overlay. Specifically, Toast being one of them, where you could specify a button via text and button action attributes inside of the Toast creation options. Now, this was really kind of different compared to how we did overlays or how we did buttons inside of alerts or other components. So with Toast and some of our overlay components, we've gone through and just made sure that they have a consistent options or a consistent way of creating them that feels close to home, that feels very similar. The only thing that you actually change is what are you creating? You still get the same title, text, and then still have an array of buttons when you create those. Now, the tools that we upgraded to are completely optional at this point. Angular Ivy and Angular 9 are optional upgrades if you want to go down that route. We're not forcing those at the moment. You can still work with Angular 8 and Angular 9 and also Angular Ivy. Why we didn't make this the default was for a few reasons. Angular Ivy is a very significant change to how Angular builds apps and how it works. So not every single library is going to be ready for this from day one. And they shipped Angular 9 with Ivy support a week before we shipped Ionic 5. We figured this would be a good time to let the ecosystem get up to speed, support Ivy, and we can still ship with Angular 8 without breaking anyone else's apps. For React projects, we updated to the latest version of React scripts, so getting all the new benefits, all the new testing utilities that are shipping with that release, you can just get those automatically for free. In fact, we have a great blog post from another one of my teammates, Eli, on how to test Ionic components in React. Then we also upgraded to the latest version of Ionicons. Now, this includes a lot of changes to how the icons are named, but the update to this and the renaming of icons is actually quite simple. And we can go into that and show you how you can at least figure out where these icons coming from and how do I update them to the latest version. So let's dive into an actual demo and upgrade an app to V5. So I have my app over here running in the browser. It's just loading up some music from Apple Music. I can go around, I can search for artists or bands that I like, have that get displayed inside of my list. Go back to browse again, load up more music. But if I open up my dev console, and let's just put this down here, I get a warning down here inside of the console log saying Ionic CSS attributes are deprecated. Replace padding text center with class ion padding ion text center. So already I'm using the last release of Ionic v4. I'm getting some hints and some help knowing that what I have is going to be deprecated or going to be removed in future releases. So let's just go over to our app and go to the browse page and make that update inside of our app. And I can see it right here inside of this component. It's just a spinner. While the actual CSS attributes still work in v4, they're going to be gone in v5. So we'll just delete this and replace it with class ion padding and ion text center. We'll hit save. Our browser will do a quick little update. And then if I clear out the logs, and then I'll just do a quick little refresh again, the warnings that my CSS attributes deprecation is gone. So I'm up to date. I'm already ready to migrate. Let's go over, and what we'll do is just exit out of our editor, exit out of the dev server, and we'll run npm install at Ionic Angular at latest. This will go through, fetch us the latest version of Ionic, which as of an hour ago is now 5.0.2. So a few patch releases have already gone out, but the major changes are still going to be the same here. Cool, so we have this updated. We're already good to go. We can run Ionic serve again. This will only take a moment to go through and update and to rebuild our entire app. And let's go ahead and take a look at what features we need to update. So in a moment, this will go through and just open up a new dev window. We'll let this kind of finish up its thing. Now, this is still going to use Angular's 8.0, its last release of 8.0. So that way, if we want to go through and update everything else, we can. So we are already up to date with v5. We notice between the two, icons look subtly different. So here in the side menu, we have the musical notes, this magnifying glass icon, and then this door or logout icon. Compare that to our previous release. The icons are slightly different, but we do have a missing icon actually down here in the bottom bar component of our app. This is going to be something that we need to update. So I know where that component is. It is inside of my track bar component. So if I go open up my app, we can look at the track player, go down to our HTML, and I know that it's this icon in particular. The name skip forward has been changed to something different. How can we find out what that is? We go to ionicons.com. We can actually just say, we'll just search for the keyword of forward. So I know that this has been renamed to something different. We now have the 3 different variations. So we have outline, filled, and sharp. In this case, I want the filled version. And this is going to be the closest match to what skip forward was. Now, it's been renamed to play forward, so that's a pretty simple update. We'll go over to our app again and replace skip with play. We'll close out the Ionicon site because we don't need to update any more icons. We'll let the rebuild happen, and then we're off to the races. Our app has been updated, our icon is there, everything works as expected, and we're happy. Now, the same steps that we covered here will apply to your React apps. You can go ahead, npm install at Ionic React at latest, at Ionic React Router at latest, and also Ionicons at latest. So instead of changing the name as a string, in React, you're just going to change the icon that you are actually importing. So all that will behave the same, and you'll have probably the similar experiences between React and Angular. Where things get a lot more fun is when we go to update to Angular 9. So in this case, we can just run ng update at Angular core, at Angular CLI. And because we're inside of a Git project and we have some unstaged changes, we need to pass the flag allow dirty. This is going to run Angular's update schematics. We'll go through, we'll update everything, it'll validate what packages we need to install and what ones need to be updated. This will include all of the core libraries like Angular Router, Angular HTTP, not Angular HTTP, Angular Router, Angular Compiler, all of their tooling, and we can see that printed out inside of our terminal. This is also going to update our version of TypeScript to the latest version. So we get a lot of features here and get a lot of new updates that we can work with. So while this installs, let's actually also go over the fact that if you're updating to a new version of Angular, there's going to be some changes that you need to be aware of. If you have a complex app, you're going to want to look at update.angular.io. This will also give you some information on, okay, well, I'm going from, let's say, a 7.0 version of an app to 9.0. What they actually do will say, hey, don't go across multiple major versions, upgrade to 8 first, and then go through the guides on how to update. So we get you covered. The ecosystem has you covered for these different changes. Let's just say we're going from 8.2 to 9.0. And we have a relatively medium app. I don't use any of these packages, so we have a pretty detailed guide on how to update everything. Basically, update your packages to the latest version, update them, and then pass the create commit flag, so that way you can have these changes as part of your version control, and then update everything else and let the update schematics handle the changes that need to happen to your project here. If we close this out and go back to our terminal, we can see these update schematics being run and applied to my project. So this is including things like removing static flags, making sure that we're adding injectables where we need them to, updating from renderer to renderer 2. If you are using any of these APIs inside of your project, you're going to want to make sure that you have them. Make sure that these are updated. So our project has been updated. We're running Angular 9. Let's just run our serve again. Now we're going to know something different down here inside of our terminal. This is going to actually go through a pre-compilation process of all of our app's dependencies. So with Angular 9, this is going to be a big feature, is that we can compile our app's dependencies separate from our app itself. So you notice in here, we are compiling Angular Core, Common, Platform Browser package as ES 2015 packages. So we're getting something that is going to handle all these dependencies because they're not going to change. Once we go and have our app up and running and the dev server running, we can worry about what changes we're making to our project versus our dependencies changing. So we can, in theory, have a lot faster rebuild times and have a much more efficient feedback cycle as we develop our app. So our app is up and running. It is inside the browser. We reloaded. Our app's already changed. Let's go ahead and go to search, and we'll open up the search page. And let's just change the title to search through Apple Music. Something real simple. We can start to see the reload times for this. Now, this is all lazy loaded, so everything is kind of split out into its own thing. But down here inside of our terminal, we have a rebuild time of 1.4 seconds for an entire app. So we're separating thing out into logical chunks and can update those as they're needed without affecting other portions of our app. This is a really nice change and a really nice update. And it kind of goes along with the idea of updating Ionic and then updating all of the other tools that developers will be using as well. So with this, our app is updated to not only the latest version of Ionic itself, but the latest version of all of our dependencies and all of our tooling that we need. So let's go back to the slides. So there's a lot that can go well with this. The upgrading process between v4 to v5 is actually a rather minor change. If you're just updating the CSS attributes, you could probably get that done in 15 minutes. And that's more or less just find and replace and make those changes as you need them. If you are modifying much more complicated and larger apps, you should be good as well. The difference between v4 and v5 is actually quite minor. As long as you are on v4, going to v5 is going to be an hour tops if you have a quite large app. Smaller apps will have a much easier time. And if you're on v3, reach out to us. We can help you out with and give you some guidance on the migration. The key thing to remember is that v5 includes not as many new things, but a lot more stable and better things to help developers move forward and get a better experience with their app. So that's it for the slides and the presentation. I want to open it up to Q&A, and we got a few questions already in the Q&A portion of in the Q&A panel. If you have any other questions right now, please feel free to submit them. Brandy and I will be sticking around for a little bit to go through these questions, so I'd love to hear them.
Hello.
Awesome. So we got a few questions going in here. Let's see. Let's go with the most important question. Will there be a recording of this? Yes, we made a note of this during the introductions. There will be a recording. There will be slides that you will get a copy of. You have this already available. This will be sent out afterwards.
Okay, so there's another question. Can we develop a PWA using Ionic? The answer is yes. We have a website. Actually, if you go to ionicframework.com/PWA, you can find a bunch of resources such as what are PWAs, how to build one, some case studies, and some FAQ.
FAQ?
FAQ.
FAQ. We also have some dedicated guides on our documentation. If you go to that PWA site, you'll get a dedicated guide to doing things like building PWAs with Angular and building a PWA with React. So there's dedicated information as well as some higher level information for you as well.
Is capacitor production ready? The answer is yes. We actually are using it by default in our React starters, and our documentation has been pushing for it for our Angular as well.
Yeah, the capacitor it reached its 1.0 some time ago, and since then we've just been updating everything, keeping the momentum going. We actually have a few customers who are already using capacitor as part of their deployment strategy, and it's their default for them. And like Brandy said, it is the default for people who are building with React, and the default for new projects created today.
Will the starter apps be updated to Ionic 5? I think the kitchen sink app is still version 4. Which one is the kitchen sink app? The conference app?
That is a good question. If we're talking about the kitchen sink app, and that is Ionic, and that is a conference app, yeah, we're in the process of actually updating that and including a lot of design changes. Brandy is basically going all out and making sure that the conference app is the best version of the conference app that it's ever been. And it will be upgraded to Ionic 5 and as well as other dependencies as well.
Yeah, I actually finished up some big design changes on the conference app, and it's in a pull request right now. But we should have that updated to Ionic 5 pretty soon. I think this week.
So if we don't have it done by this week, you can blame Brandy.
Blame Mike.
Here's a good one from Joe. Have there been any improvements, changes to lazy loading for routes? I'm not quite sure what you mean here. I know that with the latest version of Angular and Ionic, we've gone through and defaulted to dynamic imports, so they will only be loaded as they are requested. So those have been in for a few versions now. With React, maybe this could be a question. I know we have a few outstanding issues and things to investigate to make sure that we are integrating with things like React Suspense and React Lazy as well.
Here's a question. New components are looking great, and the upgrade process is nice and streamlined. Are there any plans to add new components or desktop flavors of existing ones? Date and time picker comes to mind, as well as data tables. So we do have some plans to add some new components. We actually have a user that's been contributing towards a new calendar component, and I think that one will help a lot in terms of the date and time picker. And then we also have some plans still to do some desktop improvement surrounding basically just like what the default popover looks like on desktop and versus how it acts on mobile. Data tables, we don't have any plans to implement right now.
Yeah, data tables are a very, very complex setup for this. And there's already existing libraries that are out there that can really effectively do data table and virtualization. For example, Angular has their virtual scroll implementation. There's React Window for more kind of data grid enterprise-y kind of setups. There's things like AG Grid, which is kind of the leader in the space of just grid virtualization. So there are other libraries and other alternatives that can integrate well with Ionic and give you what you need. Okay, I'll take, I'm relatively new to Ionic. I'm getting confused about Cordova and capacitor. It's a pretty common question. So Cordova itself is the original kind of hybrid app framework that everyone kind of has known for a while. Capacitor is essentially our take on how we can build web apps and deploy them to app stores, but also have a much more reliable native integration story. So the current way of how Cordova works and how that native integration happens, it's a lot of customized heavy tooling, a lot of volatility. Things can go wrong pretty quickly. Capacitor attempts to solve all of these issues by utilizing what the native platforms offer. So things like CocoaPods, Android libraries, make all of that much easier. So it is same spirit as Cordova, just slightly different details under the hood. Let's see. Brandy, here's a question for you. What's the future of Vue in Ionic?
No, that's not a question for me. That's for you.
All right.
I pass.
You pass? Okay. So Vue and Ionic, we made some initial releases and some initial progress on supporting it. And then we've been following along with View 3 and how that is going to affect the Vue ecosystems. So Ionic View, once we heard View 3 was going to be a thing, we were like, okay, well, we will pause development for a little bit to make sure that when View 3 is out, we're not shipping something, then having to re-implement everything yet again because Vue has either some breaking changes or they've redefined how their component should work. So when Vue 3 is stable and out, expect to see more news about Ionic and Vue and get that process going again.
Yes. So this one says, is there any demo app for a new to Ionic user that covers important features? That would be the conference app that we talked about earlier. We use the conference app for a lot of our testing, and it shows off some of our components like large title, segment, popover, select, date time. We pretty much just shoved as many components as we could to test it out in that app. And it uses a tabs and side menu. So I don't know, do we have like a place in the docs that links directly to the conference app?
At the moment, no, but if you go to our GitHub team page, github.com/ionic-team, we have it as one of the linked repositories. And if not, you can just search for it through there. Other examples actually that come to mind are the starters themselves. If you just go through the process of getting the CLI installed, creating your first app, and picking your templates, you can go through, create multiple starters and picking different templates and just kind of see what the setup is. We make sure that those projects follow our best practices by default and give you everything that you need to learn Ionic through the starters themselves.
Here's one. What apps are not suggested to be made with Ionic?
So this is one that I've heard quite a bit, and my opinion has changed every now and then. If you're doing anything like intense data visualization or heavy 3D graphics, like if you're making a 3D game, I would argue use the tools that are right for that. There's a lot of great 3D renderers. There's a lot of great low-level APIs that can really help you out. Maybe there's some web libraries that can also do this, but for the time being and to get the most support, there are guaranteed kind of libraries and APIs that are built just to do this versus web technologies. So if you're doing anything like video game, making the next World of Warcraft for your clients, the next Clash of Clans, that is something that you can do, and Ionic would probably not be the best option for you.
Yes. Okay, do you have any online guide to upgrade from Ionic 3? We do. We have a migration guide on our main documentation site. It's at ionicframework.com/docs, and it is under building. There is a migration guide from Ionic 3.0 to Ionic 4.0, and then there's another one for Ionic 4 to 5.
Yeah, the 3.0, what it boils down to going from 3 to 4 is essentially create a new starting point for your app and migrate features over as you need them. So upgrade one route, upgrade another route, and move those projects or move pieces over to that new project structure as they are needed. It's a little bit more of a manual process. There is some linters linters as well that can help you around with that. But we try to cover as much as we can. It's a little bit more tedious work. All right, here's a good question from someone. Will the Ionic nav controller still be available, or is it deprecated? I think for nav controller, we're going to focus a lot on having our integration story be with the framework router. So I don't know if we have any concrete plans to deprecate it. I know that we are strongly suggesting people don't use the API and that they use whatever the routing solution from that framework is. So for Angular, it's using Angular router. For React, it's using React router. A lot of what Nav Controller did was independent of these framework-specific routers. So it really doesn't serve a purpose at the moment. So nothing that we can really do. Maybe we'll plan to get rid of it, but I would highly suggest moving off of it and using the framework routers and using their APIs.
There's one that says, where are the docs for popover controller? So what we did was we used to have all of the controllers available as actual web component elements. So you could, like, if you were using a vanilla JavaScript or stencil app, for example, you would be able to include the Ion popover controller as an element and use it that way. And we removed that ability in Ionic 5 so that now you actually have to import it directly from core. This doesn't change anything if you're using Angular or React. The controllers they still work the same. But because of that, the automatically generated docs that we have went away. So we're actually working on getting some documentation either added back for the popover controller or just upping the usage in popover itself.
Let's see, there was a question in here about Ionic v5 dropping support for IE 11. Yes, we dropped support for IE 11. We actually, if you go to our docs page, we have a dedicated section on browser support, which includes updates to not only our desktop browsers, but to our mobile platforms as well, so iOS and Android. I think with v5, we have Android 5.0 and up, and then it's the last two versions of iOS. So iOS 12 and 13, and then Android 5 and up. Brandy, am I correct or am I wrong?
No, that sounds right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this one is there any reason you would suggest for someone to not upgrade from 4 to 5? No, it's basically just design updates. Everything that has been changed API wise, there's a workaround, or not a workaround, sorry, there's an alternative way to do it. Like there's a new way to do it, not a workaround. I would say maybe if you have a bug that's on an older version of Ionic 4 that's stopping you from updating to the latest Ionic 4, then maybe that would be a problem, but that would be something that we would need to know and fix.
Yeah, so if there's anything really preventing you from upgrading past a certain version of 4, open an issue, please let us know. We would love to see if there's like any technical reasons why you can't upgrade.
Yes. What Mike said.
Yes. This is a, let's see, this is a pretty interesting one, a security question. It's quite simple to do reverse engineering of a Cordova app since it is web technologies. Is there some vision of securing the source code of the Ionic app? So this is something that's already built into the modern tools. You can uglify, minify, and kind of split your app into so many different chunks and pieces that it's kind of difficult to reverse engineer. There is a difference between getting the source code and getting a workable version of your app and being able to break this apart. You can still debug and or unpack a native app as it is today, but can't really do anything with what you unpack. So with Cordova or with hybrid apps, we let the framework tool, the frameworks basically uglify everything, obfuscate it, so that way when they load up that JavaScript or load up that code, it's more or less unintelligible. Like you can't really read what's going on, but the browser knows how to interpret it. So it's kind of solved by the frameworks that you're using. At least to the point of you can uglify your JavaScript and not make it human readable.
So this one's asking, when is calendar coming? So right now we are mainly focused on just getting some bug fixes in for Ionic 5. We're not really focused on getting new features added at the moment. We have, as I said, someone working on adding calendar in a PR, but we haven't really done much review on it and it's not actually finished yet. So I would say it's definitely at least a month or two out before we even get around to looking at it.
We are excited though to add that, and have had plans for a while. So really glad to see community contributions. And when it is ready, we will make noise about it, so that way we can ask for feedback and see if it solves most people's use cases.
Yes. Sorry.
I was gonna say, there's one question on improvements to live reload. Some complex apps have challenges with live reload, especially where many plugins are used in the app. So I'm assuming based on this that this is live reload on a device. I've gone through and updated the Angular toolkit and our custom builders to support this. So you'll have a little bit more of a smoother experience for live reload on device. Live reload in the browser at least is going to also be a lot faster. As I said in the presentation, as we pre-compile all of the framework specific pieces separate from the app. So that way we can have the app just have our dev server update the app instead of having to recompile everything through Webpack again. So live reload improvements on the browser, yes. Live reload improvements on device, also yes.
I like this one. I have used a lot of libraries and frameworks, and I'm finding Ionic to be exceptionally developer friendly. Docs, UX, interface design, etc. What does that look like from inside the company? Is this something you focus on explicitly? So I would say yes, we absolutely focus on it. I spend a lot of my time whenever doing design updates actually comparing to native and making sure it lines up pixel perfect on Ionic. We have a great graphic designer that helps me out with this. From a doc standpoint, we are constantly making sure that whenever we answer an issue, there is a documentation update. Like if it's a question that can be answered with documentation and the documentation isn't there, we always make sure to go and update that documentation because we want to be able to like just send a link like this is how you do it, so that's always something that people can find. And then in addition to that, from within the company, we actually test out using the framework ourselves a lot. So we're doing a hack day on Friday, and that's basically going to be us making apps using the framework and testing out Ionic 5 and finding any kind of bugs that we can find.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time making sure that all the docs and everything from the developer experience of our product works really well. And like Brandy said, if we write a blog post or if we find something that is a common issue, it goes right back into the docs. That way we can have not only the accompanying content from the blog post, but docs to reference back to and have a much more longer lived piece of content.
Yeah.
Cool. So I think we're running low on time at the moment. There's still a few more questions in here. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them in the allotted time. So let's go with kind of one more question. Let's see. What is the best free IDE for Ionic? Well, if you ask me, I will say Vim,
Yep.
because I am a nerd like that. But VS Code is super popular on the team. Atom is also pretty still cool. Usable. I don't think we have any de facto editors that you can use that are free. VS Code probably being one of the more popular ones. It's just whatever editor and whatever IDE you're comfortable with, that's the right IDE.
I use Visual Studio Code for everything. And
But
it's nice because you can add extensions for like spell check so that you don't, type docs with spelling errors.
I need one of those.
I know.
All right, everyone. We're running low on time. We got our last question in. Thank you all for joining the webinar. Again, we will be sending out links with the slides and the presentation. Thank you all for joining, and we hope to see you in the next one.